Well, I hope that you enjoyed that video on cognitive dissonance. Please watch it if you haven't already. So you'll have a better idea about why the $1 group chose to do the task over again and said, hey, it was a more interesting task than did the $20 group. Completely counterintuitive, but great support for cognitive dissonance. And this theory of cognitive dissonance has been supported in many other ways since this classic experiment that was described. I just want to give you one other example of this that, believe it or not, cognitive dissonance really comes into play a great deal in our everyday lives. Maybe not every single day, but quite a bit. Whenever you're doing a task, I say task, but it doesn't have to be a laboratory experiment or anything. Whenever you're doing something that, takes a great deal of effort and you're not entirely convinced that it's really worth your time, that you're really getting as much out of it as you thought you would, well, that creates dissonance, okay, cognitive dissonance, where you're doing this difficult task, but you're not entirely clear that you're not getting much from it, okay? And this can apply to a wide variety of things you might be thinking of. Well, whenever that happens, you're going to try to release that dissonance, get rid of that dissonance, typically by changing your cognitions, okay, kind of like this experiment where they said, well, it was actually an interesting task. That happens a lot in everyday life where you're going to say, well, actually, the thing that's very difficult, I kind of like it. I think I'm getting something from it. You try to kind of convince yourself, and we tend to be very successful at doing this, and we don't realize we're doing it. This is very unconscious. You tend to convince yourself that you actually liked it. Again, this is very difficult to explain without using concrete examples, so I'll give you some here. Greek life is a good illustration. Fraternities, sororities. I can't speak to sororities, obviously, and I wasn't in a frat either, but based on what I know about at least some fraternities out there, it can be a little bit of a grueling process trying to get into the frat. There are some stereotypes about that, but some of them are realistic, where you have to jump through these hoops, you have to go through these sometimes difficult, grueling tasks in order to be worthy of joining the fraternity, right? Well, cognitive dissonance can come into play there, where these frat guys are making you do all kinds of weird stuff to get into this frat, and you're like, I don't know if this is worth it or not. They're making me do these terrible things, maybe not that terrible, but things that you don't enjoy doing. Well, then, hey, you make it into the frat, and you tend to be very happy about that. Well, your happiness about getting into the frat can be boosted by cognitive dissonance. How so? Well, you have this dissonance state of mind because they're making you do all these things that you don't like doing in order to make the frat. The way that you try to release that dissonance, especially if you make it into the frat, is you say, yeah, those things weren't that bad after all. I'll be willing to make other people do that in order to join the frat in a couple of years, okay? New recruits. And so the vicious cycle continues, okay? You're more likely to think that you love being in the frat, you had a great time in the frat, you're a big part of it. You're more likely to think those wonderful things about the frat, the more difficult they make the admission process to get into the frat based on cognitive dissonance, okay? So think about that. Another quick example is amusement parks, waiting in line for like an hour or two or more, just get on this ride. Let's say the ride isn't that great, okay? You're going to tend to think that it was great because you had to wait in line a really long time, okay? We don't associate the two. That seems counterintuitive. Like, why would I think that the ride was great because I had to wait in line for longer? Doesn't seem to make sense, but based on cognitive dissonance, that's how it goes. Waiting in line creates the dissonance where you're like, this sucks. I don't think the ride's going to be worth it. Then you find out the ride wasn't that great. Well, you're still going to think it was great because you had to wait in line a long time. Compared to, so take a random half of people who had to wait in line for 10 minutes, and another half of people had to wait in line for 2 hours. Same ride, okay? And let's say it's a reasonably fun ride, but not amazing. Those who had to wait for 2 hours are going to rate the ride as more fun than the people who had to wait for 10 minutes, okay? Based on cognitive dissonance theory, okay? That's basically the point here. So I guess that was a whole segment, another segment dedicated to cognitive dissonance. In the next segment, I will move on to impression formation.